Well, it's another Monday, and I got some shop stories for you guys. Really good shop stories this time, I might add. And this is about discovering what works and what doesn't on all but one of these jobs. And some of them are regarding AC repairs. And so going into the summer, that's always a good thing. So let's get started. There's an old cowboy proverb that says, good judgment is learned by experience and the results of bad judgment. And we usually do our best and most important work, or efficient work rather, on vehicles that we're familiar with. We know where the weak links in the chain are. We've worked on enough of these where when we see one with a particular problem, we know that it's going to be that in all likelihood. Now, sometimes you can get thrown by that, but at least you know where to start looking for the problem. But if we're troubleshooting and repairing something we've never worked on before, then sometimes we wind up finding ourselves in the weeds where we're trying to, and that can happen even on one you're familiar with. You can wind up thinking that you know more than you do about a vehicle and then discover that you are in new territory and you hadn't seen this before. Well, good judgment learning curve. I had some other stories, electronics stories about learning stuff that was not in a book anywhere, that you'd like to be able to say, well, I can go to a book somewhere and read about this and learn what I need to do. Anyway, you just basically have to navigate the best way that you can. And while Identifix is nice, it doesn't always have the answers. Sometimes it will just lead you to do something as a sort of a Hail Mary that you probably never would have done, and you can waste time like that. I used Identifix for a pretty good while when I was at the college, when they were letting colleges have it for free, and then they wanted to start charging $1,300 a year for it. And I told them, I said, I'm only paying $900 a year for all data, and I don't really need Identifix enough to pay the other $1,300. They said, she said, people are replacing all data with Identifix. Well, that was hooey, because you can't find anything and everything you want on Identifix, or you couldn't back then. It may be better now than it was. But this was an F-150 in a not so perfect storm. This four-wheel drive, it was one of those bad judgment learning curves. And sometimes, I don't know if you've ever run into this before, you can try to save a customer money and wind up costing yourself a lot of work and headaches. This was a windshield wiper concern though, so how hard could this be, right? The windshield wipers didn't work. Imagine yourself drawing this ticket, no problem. Now for the previous 20 plus year models leading up to this F-150, the wiper system has its switch, part of the multifunction switch, and it's wired to a dedicated control circuit in the generic electronic module. The cheaper version of that generic electronic module was called the central timer module. And there are 3 relays in the underhood fuse box, one for low speed, one for high speed, and a third relay for the washer motor. The algorithms in the GEM module software are supposed to provide relays with their marching orders based on the chosen switch position. Alright, now this is kind of how it's wired here. You might notice right here you got your generic electronic module, and it's receiving inputs. It basically puts out reference voltage here and reference voltage here. Now this is for your variable, and this is for your, so you can, over here you're seeing they sort of went European on this, with the way they did this. One multifunction switch, off, high, low, variable, intermittent, right there. See that? So whenever it was, this is 955 ohms. It's basically shorting the voltage away to certain levels in steps, so that it would know what the wipers were supposed to be doing. Of course, all of these different resistances here was for your interval wipers and whatnot. And of course, there was also a switch for the washer and all that. But you notice the central timer module slash generic electronic module was in control of these relays, and that's pretty much how that worked. I'm saying, okay, so this is the heart of the system. Alright, so the wipers and the washers are handled by the GEM, the warning chimes, the battery saver, the illuminated entry, the accessory delay, and the driver's side power window with its one touch down are all handled by the GEM module on this truck. Now there's other stuff it does too, but that's the meat and potatoes of what the GEM module does. And these have been around since like 1995. I think they first came out on Ford Windstars. And the preliminary diagnosis was the wipers wouldn't work. As we cycled the switch through its positions, looking at it with the IDS, it put shadow tracks in all the right places and none of the wrong ones, including indicating that the gem was reading crisp, accurate commands from the switch. But the wipers still didn't work. Now I was able to use the command function to turn the wipers on. I could activate the wiper relay, and when I activated the high-speed relay, they would go to high gear. When I turned the wiper relay off, the wipers would park. I could select the washer pump relay, and the washer would, the pump would wet the windshield. Okay, so this thing is getting the signals from the switch, and I can actually tell it with the IDS to command the wipers, and they would work. But when you use the switch, they would never respond. So that was what we were facing right here. See, that was our first part of our diagnostics here. The multifunction switch was replaced with the right one. I stumbled on a situation back in when I was in my dealership days back in the 90s. Whenever I was working on an expedition, and I was thinking it was a 98 model, but it was a 99 model, and I was goofy enough that I didn't check the VIN number. And I got a 98 model multifunction switch and put on this 99 model, and the wipers did all kinds of crazy stuff. They would not do anything like they were supposed to. The switches looked exactly alike, the wires looked exactly alike, but the part number was on the end was an AB instead of an AA or some garbage like that. And I found out that I went and had the parts room, I made sure I had my year model right. Oh, this is a 99 model. They pulled me one for a 99 model, and when I put it on there, it worked perfectly. And that's how that basically works. There's just enough difference from one year to another that you might, just because you hold the parts up next to one another and look at them, you might think you got the right part, but anybody that's been in this business very long and has done repair on some of the electronic systems will say, this just looking at the part is not always sufficient to knowing you got the right one. Just because it plugs in doesn't mean it'll work right. Anyway, the wiper still didn't work, even with the right switch. Well, the preliminaries, a new gem module was several $100s. The customer wanted to try to get a replacement from a salvage yard, and that seems like good logic, but it was a bad idea, and that turned out to be a train wreck. I've bought black boxes from salvage yards before, but that only works if they're plug and play. And these aren't, because they've got to have some data dump, data gathered from the old module and dumped into the new one. And I even gave the salvage yard the number that was on the old module sticker and bought a $65 used module from them that was supposed to be the right one. It did say it was for a four-wheel drive F-150, but didn't have the same prefix and suffix numbers as the original module. But apparently the crossover guide, that they have at the junkyard, I call it that salvage yard, whatever you want to call it, recycle parts yard, said that this one would work, but it didn't. We put it on there. It rides piggyback on the fuse panel, as you can see right here. This is the main fuse panel, and this thing rides piggyback on it and plugs into it. And that's the one we bought from the salvage yard. You can see the paint stick numbers on it. That's a telltale every time that you got it from the salvage yard. All right. With the used replacement gem module in play, you could turn the wipers on low and then high, and then they would work. But when you turned them off, they'd stay on high, and sometimes the washer would just randomly start spraying. Well, that wasn't going to work, so there was some electronic garble going on here. I used the IDS to load the data from the original gem and tried to put it in the, but see, apparently, once you get this gem loaded, when you get a remanufactured one, it probably comes blank. I expect this is probably non-volatile memory, that you cannot go back and redo one that you've done before. In other words, once it's written in there, it's permanent, and that would explain this. My buddy Donnie was working on a Dodge one time, or a Jeep or something, at the dealership, and we were actually a Jeep dealer. It might have been a Jeep Grand Cherokee, I don't know, but the long and short of it was he took an air conditioner controlled head, and he put it on there, and he had his DRB3 plugged in, and it asked if it had a ambient temperature sensor, and he said it did. Didn't go look, just said it had an ambient temperature sensor off the cuff. So whenever he plugged it in and tried to use it, there was a light, one of the indicator lights was blinking on the thing all the time. And so he called the hotline and they asked him if he selected that it had an ambient temperature sensor, and he said he did. And they said, well, if it doesn't, it's going to expect to see one and it's going to flash that light. And he says, well, how can I fix this? They said, you're going to have to replace the control head again because you cannot undo that selection once you made it. And he says, well, how am I supposed to know this? And they says, by doing it. And he says, okay, so let me get this right in my mind. He says, burn, and learn. Once you burn the data into it, of course the thing about it is you need to pay attention and see if it's got an ambient temperature sensor before you ever tell the new module that it does. I think that's what's going on here. This one here had already written the data in there that could not be erased. This wasn't like a reflashable EEPROM in a PCM that juices up to 18 volts, wipes the data, and then rewrites the program. It was basically trying to write on top of data that was already there. That's why we had error codes and all that. Well, if you're successful replacing a gem with a used one from another truck, you're lucky. We didn't have that luck. This is what we learned. The module didn't work. We got some wiper action, which told us the module was indeed the problem. Another module couldn't be sent because the warehouse blew away in a storm that happened about that time. So we got another module, and that gave us good wipers, but the windows wouldn't work. All right, so they sent another module finally. It was funny. The power windows wouldn't work because the gem wouldn't turn on the accessory delay relay. So we had wipers but no windows, and we were back to square one. See, these were non-starters. You can't say, we said, we got your wipers fixed, but your windows are broke. And, you know, we could have actually just jimmied the accessory delay relay where it would be on all the time, but, you know, that's not going to be anything that's going to be permissible either. All right. The discovery was that in this case, it would have been smarter to begin with a refurbished module from the Ford dealer instead of going through all of this Robin Hood's barn business. As it turned out, the person just said that they would deal with the problem and maybe put some Rain-X on their windshield or something. They just didn't want to fix it. And I said, okay, well, we tried, you know. Well, we had another similar situation that wasn't electronics related. This 2005 F-153 valve, it was a patch story, and it turned into a $2,500 mistake. The guy comes in on the hook, had a timing chain slider failure. You know, these sliders here, you know, that come apart and all. So they wanted to try to fix it instead of replacing the engine. Well, one of the things that these tensioners that tension the timing chain, they don't work right unless you've got consistently have to have more than 25 psi of engine oil pressure, or they're not going to keep the timing chains tight, and they're going to rattle and stuff like that, and there's eventually going to be some serious problems. Also lets them get out of time a little bit. And so I told him what the risks were. I said, we really need to put an engine in this truck. He had bought it for almost no money because it wasn't running when he bought it. And so I said, we can try it, but I'm advising against this. And he said, well, let's go ahead and try it. Okay, so it needed all the timing chain stuff. We replaced the oil pump while we were there, since we had all that out there. Needed a set of roller rockers on bank one, because some of them had come apart. We replaced the bearings in the bottom end, you know, to try to make sure that we had as good oil pressure as possible. There wasn't bearing wear. The thing ran like a sewing machine, but it still lost oil pressure when it was hot. It would get down to about 22 pounds of pressure, and you could hear the timing chain rattling. When you first started it, while the oil was cold, it did just fine. So it was going to have a replacement head because it seemed out the cam saddles were worn out enough to where they were losing the oil pressure, I guess, because everything else was good. And the guy didn't want to spend the money on that, but I told him, I said, you can probably drive this truck until you can do better, you know, by putting some stuff in there to thicken the oil, you know, like a little bit of motor honey or something like that. And he agreed with that. He says, yeah, I think I'll do that instead of spending any more. He'd already spent as much money on it as he would have spent putting a motor in it, because you know, the cost kept going up and up and up and up. And again, we didn't even charge any labor there at the college. Well, this one right here wasn't as much of a learning thing as it was an interesting little journey. We did AC was inoperative. We vacked and recharged it. We put dye. We didn't find any leaks till we saw the evaporator drain turning green down here. Now, okay, we got a leak in the evaporator. You know, we started out by doing the identifier. There was nothing in there but air. We put nitrogen in it. It wouldn't leak like that. But when we put that dye in there and we saw this, we were good. So the evaporator, the orifice tube line, we put it in there. That one I showed that was cut last week came from this particular vehicle. And there was a leak in the evaporator. It was leaking at the corner. Tim had taken it out of there and he was holding it while I took the picture. But he made it happen and they got cold air. Now this 2008 Charger was a learning situation here. If you had to, he said you had to try to start it about 100 times before it even spun the starter. And that's the way he described it, and that's how I wrote it up. So the next day he managed to keep trying to start it until it finally started up. And then he brought it the next morning. We never could get it to start a single time. We turned that thing, you know, you stick this little fob looking thing in the plastic and you turn it and it just didn't do anything. So that was really something else. Well, the scan tool wouldn't talk and the CAN bus was dead. We poked around in the schematics and determined the totally integrated power model might be at fault. Well, he already had bought one of those, he just hadn't put it on. So he said, hey, you put this one here, and this one was a plug and play, unlike the GEM module on the F-150. And we put it on there. It didn't change anything. Well, I was kind of glad that he had already bought it so that we didn't have egg on our faces, although we told him we thought that might be what it was, you know. Well, I went in and fielded a call to ALLDATA Tech Assist. Which, you know, they were pretty good sometimes. I've been misled by them a time or two, but I figured I'd just for the heck of it give them a call. And he said, check for power and ground of the wireless ignition module. That's the thing you stick your fob key looking thing in there and turn it to start it. And so I said, okay, all right. Now, this is how it's wired. Now, I cut some of the stuff out that went other places. But the network is basically wakes up whenever you turn this thing on. It's getting input from the stop lamp switch, a shifter, the steering column lock module, and the total integrated power model, you know, is sending power to it and all that. It had power and ground, basically. And so I said, okay, what are we going to do about this? Well, we had power and ground, and we found a rebuilder in San Antonio that would refurbish this thing for $149, but we had to send both the fobs with it. So I had the guy bring the other fob in. We sent both the fobs and this module. Paid them $149. All right, we got pay dirt. When it came back, fired right up. Everything was perfect. The door locks wouldn't work though unless the key, the wireless ignition module, the key was turned on. So in other words, if you turned off the key, you mashed the lock fob button, or you know the locks were just dead. With the key on, the lock buttons and the fobs worked just fine. The accessory delay problem wasn't working right. The windows and the radio always kept working even after the doors were opened. In other words, they were always powered up. And the courtesy lights wouldn't work. Anyway, you know, they wouldn't work unless the key was on, as I remember. But the long and short of it was we had to figure this out now. Was this something that was related to this new thing? Could it be causing this the thing they rebuilt? It had no idea the doors were open, and the cluster seemed to be the module that received the door open input. Of course, we got network stuff going on here, just remember that, you know. Alright, so it turned out, and watch this pre-planted bug, somebody had left the fuse out. We didn't know it at first. We found fuses 14 and 17 both feed the cluster. This fuse right here was not even there. And it was like that when it came in. We had never touched that fuse panel when we were doing our previous diagnostic. But somebody had jerked that fuse out of there, and that had rendered, that one fuse caused all of the problems I had just described on the previous slide. Somebody had planted this, you know, so this fuse here, 14 on that, and fuse 17, you know, both go to the cluster, but that one wasn't there. And so we basically did look to see which fuses fed the cluster as when we were tracking it all down and everything. There was it'll be probably mentioned again in a different, or has mentioned or something. Anyway, there was this 97 Altima, I think it was. It was a Nissan of some kind, and it would start really, really hard first time in the morning. After that, it started okay once you finally got it started. But you spin. And the other shop over had tried another engine controller on it, couldn't get it to start, couldn't get it to do anything. We found out somebody had removed a fuse from the from the fuse panel, and that fuse was the one that delivered the start signal to the engine controller, and that start signal would cause the engine controller to double pulse the injectors so that it would start normally. And engine controllers double pulse injectors on first start. Instead of having an accelerator pump like our carburetors used to have, or a cold start injector like some of the Asian ones had, they just double pulse all the injectors and then they go sequential. It never got a start signal on that one, so it was spin and it was just firing the injector sequentially. That wasn't enough gas to get it started when it was cold. All we had to do to fix that one was replace a fuse. All right. So this 2008 Nissan Quest was another inoperative AC. We had put some juice in it about 3 or 4 years earlier, and it had worked perfectly ever since then, until about halfway through the summer. When we fired this thing up and turned on the AC, it initially started cooling, but the pressures, this pressure over here ought to be down here, and this pressure over here ought to be here somewhere. But this pressure was high, and this was too. This kept getting higher and higher and higher to the point of being dangerous. And within 2 minutes now of running the AC, the pressures went crazy like this. All right, so just love the way that this is the fan schematic on that. I used to use this schematic to give a hard test to some of my electrical students, and I'd say, what would happen if you energized all 3 of these relays at the same time? Well, if you do that and you trace the way everything happens, it will actually feed a ground through here and blow that fuse. So if it ever energizes all 3 of those, but that wasn't the point here. I just wanted you to see this schematic because it's incredible. Now, we didn't need to trace the whole circuit. We just needed to test the fan that wasn't working. One of the fans wasn't working. We had noticed that whenever we were looking at it earlier. Okay, so whenever you see a schematic like this, these represent brushes, and this represents a commutator. So this one has 4 brushes. Now what happens is, the way you get different speeds on some of these motors is if you have brushes coming in directly across from one another, you're going to have full speed. If you got brushes coming in like here and here, it's going to be a lower speed, right? So that's pretty much the way that works. Some wiper motors are like that. They've got a high speed and a low speed, and so on and so forth. So one way or another, we connected our test light from the positive to pin number 2 and going out pin number 4. Now this is basically sort of like what that looked like. I didn't put those numbers aren't in the right places for what I did, but basically if you went to any of these, you could go to 3 and 4, 1 and 2, 1 and 3, any of them, because that commutator is spinning underneath all those brushes, and you're going to see it go off if there's any parts of that commutator that are dark. And so any DC motor can be tested that way if it's not a brushless DC motor. You cannot test a brushless DC motor, but you also anyway, I'm not going to go into brushless or brushed DC motors. This one here, the light was off more than it was on. We put that fan on there and we fired the thing back up. These are actual photos of the gauges. We were looking at 40 psi here and 200 here. See the difference? The pressure was less than half as long as there was coolant flow. Now, if you got any doubts about something like that, you can also take a bottle of water, like if you think there's internal clogging in the evaporator, in the condenser, you can spray water on that condenser, cool water, and you can tell wherever it doesn't evaporate will be an internal clogging and refrigerant fluids in that condenser. That's another story entirely. Finally, had a 2008 SRX. We checked it for AC issues and a power steering leak. Now we found a bad high pressure transducer, which on that one was pretty doggone expensive, and they rejected that. They said, well, I don't spend that money on that. I think it was over $100 or something along with it, because it had 3 wires going to it, and it basically had put out an analog signal on the pressure. The steering rack was leaking, with a pretty bad power steering leak. That's a picture of that. And while we were there, we noticed that this drop of coolant was dripping off this. When we got a better look at that, we found out that this clamp had popped right there, and those clamps can fail, you know. So, but the worm clamps can fail too. So don't, you know, they're not an end-all be-all. Anyway, that pretty well winds up our thing today. This was going to be about 25 minutes long, and I really appreciate you guys coming by. And have a great week, and let's all be careful out there. I'll see you next week.